Whoosh! And here we are for another Whiskey Me live tasting. The second one in a month. Aren't you lucky? This is, of course, our very last minute organised, but don't let that make you think it's not going to be great. Bonus pouch tasting of Big Peat. So all of you tuning in, unless you just stumbled across this in your Facebook feed, well done. You managed to get yourself organised for the tasting this evening, and we're super excited to do it with you. Hopefully, you still have some Big Peat left. We sent out over 10,000 pouches of Big Peat to all of our members as our bonus dram for reaching 10,000 Whiskey Me members. So give yourselves a pat on the back. Hope you got some left. If you haven't, understandable. It's a delicious whiskey. Maybe pour yourself something else that's probably smoky to get yourself in the mood. And we'll see if we can make the whole of the British Isles smell of smoke by all pouring a Big Peat at the same time. To help us on this tour of Big Peat for our tasting tonight, I'm going to introduce Dougal Barr from Douglas Laing. And here he comes. Hey, Dougal.
Hey, here we go.
Thanks for coming on this evening and doing this with me.
No, my pleasure. It's what I'm here for. I'm here to talk about all things our big yellow fisherman. So.
Is there a I want to get into Big Peat and the whole kind of like cult figure that he's becoming. Is there sort of like a whole backstory about this character? And you say he's a fisherman, but is there more to it than that? Has anyone written his biography?
There's definitely a bit of a story to it. I don't know if you want to dive straight into it straight away, but there is a story to it that we can touch on.
Right, let's go. Well, that's good. We've teased it up, and then we'll come to it in 5 or 10 minutes, and this will hopefully retain our viewers because they're like, I can't leave until I've heard the biography of Big Peat. Let's not get into it. Let's start by introducing you. So you work for Douglas Laing. You're a brand ambassador. Tell us a little bit about Douglas Laing and what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So Douglas Laing's now third generation of a independent Scottish-run, very much family business as such. It really started back in the 40s, 1948. Fred Douglas Laing Senior, if you like. So he essentially post-war actually ended up inheriting a brand called the King of Scots, which is still around, still going strong. Often you'll see it around occasionally in very much everywhere in the world now. But King of Scots was a blended Scotch that he basically inherited the rights to the name and 3 casks. So really it was like, you have a recipe, but now you need to go and build your own stock of it. So he really built this company from the ground up with one recipe for a blended Scotch. And then over the years, that kind of slowly developed into the occasional build-up of stock and then building up into maybe some single cask expressions, some more blended expressions, and eventually we end up with some age statements of King of Scots and things like that. Things developed through the next 20, 30 years of the company. Fred Laing Jr. came into the company in the late 60s, and him and his brother helped develop further, kind of explore a few more brands. More and more brands came under the Douglas Laing & Co. name, if you like. And then from there, again, progressing forward, we did very well when others didn't. Kind of that real whiskey hit in late 70s, early 80s when single malt Scotch was very much in decline. Blend was king, but even everything there was declining. And then, we end up doing very well in the Asia Pacific and very much quite a niche market in terms of golf apparel and golf tie-ins and very much in the ceramic decanters and all these amazing things. We've still got so much evidence of it and it still exists, but there's this huge tie, and the reason we essentially survived as a company was these ceramics and things like that for bottling or blended Scotch. And then Big Peat kind of
Scottishness, basically.
Yeah, a little bit. So in Fred's own words, it was very much, we have whiskey, we have Scotland, we have tartan, we have bagpipes, and we have golf. So what's the best way to sell your product? Well, you're there. You've got everything in hand. And then Big Peat really developed in kind of early first decade of the 2000s, so around 2008, 2009. And this is where it gets a bit ridiculous for anyone listening in, is we had this glut of Islay whiskey. We literally had too much stock to play with. And so Fred was playing around with blending these single malts together from the individual distilleries that we had bulk stock of. So, I mean, it seems odd to say it now, kind of 12, 13 years later, to have too much Islay stock, but that is the birth of Big Peat behind me. It is literally this development of a blended malt because we had too much stock.
And how does that work now then? Because obviously Isla's sort of booming, there's new distilleries opening, and everyone wants to sort of slice of that pie. Is it an issue now getting hold of stock, or is it just a case of you're buying in early enough to have it?
Oh yeah, so some of the business has kind of changed. Of course, whiskey's changed a lot in the last 70 years, but for us, we still have some essentially gentlemen's handshake agreements that Fred's dad put in place back in the 50s that are still respected today. So we still get stock that way. A lot of it is really focused now on, it's kind of our ethos is really bringing something to the table. You could be an independent bottler, but you could buy a cask and just put it straight into bottle. So really you've done nothing in there. So for us, it really is about having a full filling schedule. So we are buying the bulk spirit itself from these individual distilleries, and then we are selecting the casking. We are in charge of the maturation. We are in charge of the blending at the end. We're trying to add these layers in that we can control the quality of. So I think that's where the business has maybe changed a bit more. So it's very much focused on now we are 30 years planned ahead in terms of everything we're looking at stock-wise and how the company is growing. But we are still, certain deals are new, certain deals are 70 years old and still going strong. So it's, an interesting combination.
Yeah, right. It's nice to hear that there's still those sort of personal relationships in, an industry that's sort of still quite well dominated by corporates and, big brands and everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Nice
So
going on.
For us as well, for my personal viewing, I had a meeting to discuss the history of Douglas Laing with Fred last week. He's still involved. He's still got such a pride in continuing that name and that legacy on that his dad started. And now with Cara and his daughter, who's now in charge of our marketing side, and his son-in-law Chris, Cara's husband, is our CEO. It's such a small family business that everyone takes that pride in continuing on the legacy that Fred Senior started. So.
So it's a mixture of Islay whiskies. Now, do you divulge which distilleries produce the whiskey that goes into it?
So you do. With Big Peat, we can, as with a lot of blended malts, sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. With Big Peat, we can divulge a fair amount, I think. We always try to be quite transparent about the process that's going on here. So I think for us, we've got a combo of some Kalila, we've got a combo of Ardbeg, some Bowmore, and the ever mysticised and fanciful Port Ellen, which really is that, again, going back to 2009 and saying we had a excess stock of Port Ellen for anyone today, that seems like sacrilege, but that's how it ends up.
And so have you, over the years, sort of felt this burden to continue to put Port Ellen into the blend, even though obviously the value of Port Ellen whiskey has probably gone up by an order of magnitude, if not more?
Yeah, I think we're conscious of it. Of course we are. I think you wouldn't last long if you weren't conscious of it. And I think also when this development first started with Big Peat and Fred's creation of Big Peat, if you imagine at that point, Port Ellen would already been closed for 25 years or so. So if you imagine the stock that we had from that point is now an extra 10, 12 years on top of that. So you're looking at the Port Ellen is approaching 40 years old. So there, in terms of the amount of Port Ellen going into it, I wouldn't like to divulge, but it's definitely changed probably a little bit. So
yeah, sure. So for anyone not aware of Port Ellen, which you might not be aware, it's sort of taken on a kind of almost mystical status amongst collectors. A distillery that closed in the 80s.
Yeah, 83.
83, yeah. And again, when there was, a glut of whiskey and Islay whiskies were not in demand, as you already mentioned, blends were much bigger back then. And then, of course, since then, times have changed. And now, like a few other close distilleries, it's become, really sought after. And like you say, the price in the last 10 or 15 years has just gone up dramatically. And really the amount of Port Ellen released as a Port Ellen single malt is less and less, and the price is higher and higher, to the point where you wonder if some of the people buying it are ever actually going to drink it because it's so expensive.
Well, yeah, I'd like to think this is our opportunity for introducing people to even a hint of Port Ellen in there is the perfect introduction. Let's people involved. We don't want this whiskey sitting on a shelf kind of deal. We want whiskey open. We want whiskey in hands and people enjoying it. So
yeah. So if you're going to sort of this is putting you on the spot a little bit. Sort of summarize in a word or two what each of those distilleries might be bringing to this this blended malt. I mean, obviously they're all smoky distilleries, but where would you sort of like place the character of them individually? I guess just to get a better idea of how this mix comes together in the way it does in Big Peat.
Okay, yeah. So I guess maybe for anyone that's unfamiliar blended malts, so initially or pre-2009, this was known as vatting malts, which is essentially the same process that every big single malt producer does today with their own single malts. But what we are doing is introducing individual distilleries and bringing them together. So every drop of it is still 100% single malt Scotch, but we can then just play with the individual flavors, like you're saying, Tristan, this distinctly different characters of these distilleries. We can then balance out and create something quite unique and quite different. I guess start with Kalila. Kalila is quite fruit forward. It's actually quite light and aromatic. It's not what a lot of people expect for Islay whiskies. I think when people pick up a glass of the Kalila, it's actually very much fruit forward. A lot of it's down to its kind of distillation style and its kind of longer fermentations. It's designed to be fruity and a bit lighter, so it tends to come across. Well, we'll wait until we get into Big Peat to see if we can pick it out. Ardbeg
I've always found it quite citrusy, Kalila.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have that, that real kind of fruity, tall stills, long fermentation. Citrus starts to make sense. So it is that everything you can start to pick out is there. Ardbeg, I guess, is our big smoky boy in this one. It's a bit more of a meaty punch, if you like. It's bringing higher ppm rate. It's again still known to be quite zesty. Again, coming back to that citrus note, but certainly it brings a bit more heft and heat to the dram, I guess. Bowmore, we generally talk about Bowmore about bringing balance. For me, I would always almost see Bowmore as another summary of Islay in a glass, if you like. It's elegant, it's smooth, but with the peat in the background, it's still quite fruity, but very easy drinking. It brings that kind of smooth nature to it. And then the Port Ellen, again, I appreciate it's in lots of different varying amounts within it, but Port Ellen certainly brings, like say, that mystical element to the dram. But Port Ellen, from all discussion from when Port Ellen was still in operation versus the kind of lore that surrounds it now, it was always seen as the epitome of an Islay dram. It was smoky, it was briny, it was heavy but fruity, it was orchard fruits, yet dry and salty. It had literally every element that we kind of pick out of individual Islay distilleries separately in one single dram. So for us, it comes down to picking these individual characters, playing around with them, getting the balance right, so that it's not too much of one dominating the other, and then producing that kind of harmony in the bottle at the final point.
Yeah, nice. For anyone interested, Port Ellen is actually reopening, isn't it? I don't know if is it producing already now, or is it not there yet?
I don't think not yet. I don't think so. I think it was.
It's imminent, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think COVID slowed a lot of things down for a lot of people.
Yeah,
that was one of the same. Yeah, plowing straight ahead.
Whiskey come out of there, and even longer before we see any sort of 10-year-old or whatever. Obviously, that will be at least 10 years.
I mean, apparently they are trying to recreate it as close as possible. They're not trying to do it exactly, but they've got the still architects, they've got everything, they've got architectural drawings of the stills to try and recreate it. But the people that made it are the backbone of that distillery character. So you can replicate as much as you possibly can. You can't replicate those people from 40 years ago. So
yeah, that's it. I've done a tour of the maltings there before, which, by the way, Port Ellen, after it closed, actually, possibly even during when it was still open, I don't know, there was a maltings there, but it's where a lot of the peated malt for the Islay distilleries is made. All the different distilleries in Islay. Obviously, some distilleries do some of their own malting floors and things like that, but there's a lot of malt juice there. Anyway, when I was there, I sort of asked, is there any remnants of the old distillery? And I think they showed us a still. I think that was all they had, basically, from the original distillery, and everything else had just basically been gutted out.
Yeah, essentially everything got torn down, ripped out, and gutted, and all converted to maltings. But it's looks like it's coming back, and it'll be interesting to see how it compares. Yeah,
totally. Yeah. Right, cool. Let's have a taste. I'm a little bit behind here because there are people who have already got. I think that we might have broke the record. Someone dived in with a tasting note within about 2 or 3 minutes. It used to be a case when we did these tastings, I was like, right, everyone, now let's taste, and we all tasted together. But I think it's probably my own fault. I kind of set a precedent for just like jumping in whenever you feel like it, and that's what we do now. And why not?
I think it's to be encouraged. But like I say, whiskey's for drinking. It's what it's there for.
Exactly. Oh, here we go. Someone, I don't know if this is a relationship of yours, Julie Barr. Smells like burnt down fire.
I don't think not a relation to mine, as far as I'm aware. I appreciate it.
I wonder, are either you or Julie related to the Iron Brew family or not?
Alas, no. There's no bar fortune, at least for me.
God, you could have eaten out all your life, just sort of with that in your locker, you know.
You can only hope. Sadly, no.
Here we go. Sweet smoke and slightly salty on the nose.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking through it as well. We call the Big Peat. Lots of people assume that's going to be a big punch of peat right in the face as soon as you stick your nose in it, but it's not. And I think this where you tie back to your kind of fresh, citrusy, quite green grassy notes that you might expect for a Kalila or something like that. But I would say the peaty punch that follows as soon as you get it right in the back of the palate, so you had that first taste of it, then you start to see these individual distilleries start to appear.
Yeah, I get I think it's fruity on the nose, and I think initially on the sip as well, it's got a light and really nice sweetness to it, and fruit. I would say a little bit of citrus, but then about halfway through, for me, I really start to get black pepper, like smoked black pepper.
Yep,
like real lovely that dry black pepper spice. It's really good.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I should probably highlight our big opportunity with our blended malts and every whiskey Douglas Laing produces, or whether we're bottling single cask expressions or blended malts or anything like that. We try to do it as close to the distiller intended. So for us, we will never add colouring to any of our whiskies. They're generally all bottled at high strength. So in Big Peat's case, you're looking at 46% ABV. I don't think you particularly notice that increase, but it means that everything we produce is non-chill filtered. So we really are trying to kind of as pure as possible. That's really what we're after here. So lots of people see Big Peat being this super kind of very light, almost see-through, crystal clear dram. It's incredibly light in the glass. But I think we've gotten so used to seeing whiskey with colouring added and whiskey with big sherry influence that people are obsessed with this. Oh, it's darker, that must mean it's better. Whereas this, it's got so much flavour. So as soon as you get that in your actual mouth and start tasting it, you realise that Big Peat is coming through just as soon as you get past it. So
yeah, it's true. It's so light in colour, isn't it?
So it's all ex-bourbon finish. So it's every single drop. But yeah, all ex-bourbon. Right. So that's where we're getting that kind of light, like sort of almost like barley colour in there. And then also you picked out that kind of peppery note. So again, ties in nicely with that ex-bourbon cask. So that American oak, that nice black pepper, spicy note in there. All starts to make sense when you break it down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes pale whiskies, there's something there that can make them almost more powerful in the flavour because you're not expecting it. You know what I mean? Like its lightness belies the intensity of the flavour, and so it's all the more impactful. Whereas if this was bright red or, like a really deep amber, you'd almost expect an intensity, and therefore when you get that, it feels comparatively lighter. Does that make sense? It's like a reverse psychology.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and like I say, I think whether it is because we've gotten used to it in drinking whiskey today, that we expect it to look a certain way, and that's kind of been lost along the way of what whiskey can be. You can get very old whiskey that's light and pale and like I say, looks delicate, but it could be heavy and meaty in the background. And for us, we're just trying to emphasize that. So we're not shying away from it. It's definitely about highlighting just everything the whiskey's about individually. So every whiskey's quite different.
Yeah. So I noticed on your website that you do a lot of different sort of special release Big Peats, seasonal ones, annual Isla Festival ones, and other bits and pieces. Do you want to quickly rattle through some of the highlights of that selection? Because
absolutely.
If you like Big Peat, and obviously you can buy a bottle, but there's other iterations of peat available.
I think that's a fun bit. So Big Peat sits within a grouping of 6 our remarkable regional malts. So they've got the 6 that are best. We try and show the best, in our opinion, our kind of view, if you like, the best example of each of our regions plus the islands as a grouping of together. And I appreciate not a region, but the idea is for us to then, you can pick up one single bottle and that is a snapshot of the region. So Big Peat was the original, it's the first one of the group, and then we slowly added on from there. The advantage of that is every single time we do it, it's always a small batch. It's generally, you're only talking upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 cases sometimes, and even smaller than that. So we do a lot of individual batches, which means they can be quite variable, which means we can play around with them, which means we can do lots of special releases, like you say. I'd say the key ones for us is, of course, the fishy old bottlings. So we've done some interesting ones in the last couple of years. Last year's was a petrichor, so this idea of the smell and taste of rain on Islay, which is, if you've been to Islay, is pretty common.
The Islay Festival.
Yeah, so that again gives you a kind of hint at what you might expect in Islay in May. Well, hopefully not. And then our Christmas editions they always go down really, really well, because generally we serve up our Christmas editions at cask strength. So not only taking that high strength, but serving up Big Peat at cask strength. We have an age statement Big Peat. We have a few different age statement limited editions over the years. So it allows us that kind of playing around and that freedom to, as we see something interesting, we can release it, or we can see an event and we can react to it. So Big Peat's best pal is a Speyside malt with Scallywag. We did a Year of a Tiger for this year and things like that. So we can do lots of interesting things to adapt to the around.
It's quite cool, isn't it? Because all these different releases, but all still playing within the confines of whatever whiskey you can get from Islay. And that's a fun thing to experiment, because of course do you ever bring in other distilleries, or are you always sticking with those 4, or can you not say?
With Big Peat, those 4 make Big Peat, if that makes sense. So for us, that recipe has not dramatically changed since Fred came up with it in 2009. So that's where the kind of consistency, because we don't want it to be like a single cask. We don't want it to be totally different. We want it replicatable and consistent. And this is the remarkable regional malts. There's the big bulk of the company now today. We've moved beyond the blended scotches, and we've moved beyond single casking dominating. It's the blended malts that are really carrying us forward. So we want them to be as consistent as possible, so people know what to expect. I think there's a demand for consistency in whiskey today that we can get as close to as possible every single time. So the recipe stays pretty much the same.
Yeah, we've not ever featured many, if any, blended malts on Whiskey Me before. Pretty much everything I think we've done one at Timorous Beastie, maybe. But everything else has been single malts or single distilleries, because of course we do all the international whiskies now as well, with the bourbons and everything, but always from an individual distillery. But I think it's fun to try blended malts and blends as well, for that matter. But I think the blended malt category in particular is such an interesting one, because it just allows that additional level of sort of freedom to sort of tailor and design the flavor profile of a whiskey that you don't necessarily get with a single distillery, because you've only got that sort of particular palette of flavors to be able to play with. When you're blending from multiple distilleries, you can really fine tune that, can't you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's maybe the one big part of my job is maybe that education side behind what a blended malt actually is. And I think blend almost became like this dirty word in Scotch whiskey that, blends aren't good, even though there's plenty of amazing blends out there. For us, it's almost like if you took a chef and you handed them one ingredient, I'm sure they could do some wonderful things with that one ingredient. Instead, what we've got is 4 wonderful ingredients that we can then balance out with each other. We can play around with them. Like you say, we can be a little bit more creative. And that's where the kind of art form behind what Fred and Chris and Cara do when we start looking at these whiskies individually and bringing them together in the right balance. And that is an art form in itself, like literally balancing these 4 quite dramatic flavors and bringing them all together in the final bottle.
Yeah, I just think you get to sort of really taste the endeavors of the blender themselves. I mean, the other thing, of course, is like, we kind of put single malts on a pedestal, but of course they're all blended, unless it's a single cask, there's still blending going on there. It's just all done in-house, in the same distillery. So it's still the same process. It's just that broader spectrum of colors to play with. Like you say, I mean, the ingredients analogy is a good one. Just gives that bit more creative freedom.
Yeah, I think it was this. There was an attitude problem, I think, in whiskey. Certainly, even like 5 or 6 years in the industry, is like it's changing. Like we're not. Don't get me wrong, I still wear tweeds to work quite a lot, but there's an attitude that came along with tweed wearing and a kind of stuffiness around it. And you can imagine 12, 13 years ago when Fred presented a Isle of Fisherman bright yellow bottling, bright yellow branding. It is quite a disruptive look to it.
Yeah.
And Fred's told me about times when he's been doing tastings very early on with Big Peat, and you'd do it at an event and people would turn their nose up at it, and he'd pull out an unmarked bottle of Big Peat and let people try it. But, oh yeah, that's more what I like. That's proper single malts, isn't it? It's liquid talks for itself. It's just because it's got a fisherman. It's just about appealing to a different audience.
Exactly. Well, you don't have to sell it to me. We have the same thing with the pouches, and we're like, don't take offense to the pouch. It's there for a reason. It keeps our prices down. But more importantly, it's the liquid that's inside it that counts, Yeah.
I'd say it's maybe the biggest fight we have is getting people to try blended because it's got the word blended in there. It's just, it really is just getting liquid to lips and we're laughing. But.
So has the story of the character Big Peat evolved in some way then? Does he have a kind of backstory that someone's writing?
So it came from when Fred was playing around. So this is Fred Jr., so our chairman presently, semi-retired, but you might still see him around at a few events and tastings. But he's trying to retire, but he also doesn't want to retire, I think. So at this point, Fred was playing around back in 2008, 2009 with getting all these individual liquids come together and sort of balancing them out and seeing what he could come up with. And it was described to him as having, it's like it's got this real Big Peat flavor. And in Fred's mind, instantly he went to, that's a man. That is Big Peat. And in Fred's vision, this is maybe where it came to develop over the years, was in Fred's idea and Fred's mind, Big Peat was this fisherman that he'd been not quite lost at sea, but he'd been fighting his way back home to Islay after a week or two at sea. And he realized that he'd been away for a week or two and his wife wasn't going to be too happy with him coming back to Ireland after a couple of weeks. So he needed a bit of courage to kind of step in there. And so he took a big gulp of Islay malt, and first initial drawings of Big Peat had him smiling, and Fred pushed back and said, no, I don't want him smiling. I want him to have that big slap in the face of peat look as he prepares to face his wife at the other end after disappearing for a couple of weeks. So that is kind of a rough, very quick telling. Fred will always tell it better than me, but that look is supposed to summarize someone's expected telling off at the other end. So.
Well, it looks like he's been slapped in the face, doesn't it? That's the kind of look, because the hair's so
whether it's a PT slap versus a angry other half slap. I think
preemptive wife slap.
Yeah, but so that face you make when you get hit with a huge PT malt, that's really what Fred tried to capture with Big Peat. And over the years we developed it from there. But a fisherman coming home and taking his big hit of Dutch courage, if you like, to face up.
Right, a more general question there, which I might as well throw at you. As you guys are experts, I don't know if I am.
I didn't claim
that. How would you recommend to sip your whiskey?
I think it's really personal. I think for me, Big Peat stands up really well as it comes. I think even at that kind of higher ABV, that I think if I opened it and said, everyone tasting this blind and not telling anyone the ABV, I think very few people would question it. With water, I'd always say try a whiskey as it comes, as my own personal ethos for drinking whiskey. Try it as it comes. If you enjoy it, great. Wait until you get halfway down the glass, then add a drop or two of water, see if anything changes for you. It might not. It might change dramatically. Some whiskeys really, really jump out from the glass with those couple drops of water. I would just say every whiskey is quite unique in that way. I think there's no rough rule of thumb. I think it's about developing what you like. If I was going to be that real pretentious, annoying person in the bar, I'd often ask for a glass of whiskey and ask for a second glass, split it across 2 glasses, and then you can do one with water and one basically out the bottle strength, and then you're good to go. Get a comparison going. Yeah, but for me, I don't see there's no right or wrong with drinking whiskey. Drink it however the hell you like to drink it. It's a very personal drink. So
yeah, I think it's a process of trial and error, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think when you've got sorry, Tristan. Yeah,
I was going to say the errors are never that bad because you're still drinking whiskey. You know?
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's the big thing that matters. But even if you're playing around with cast strength whiskey, you've got maybe a bit more wiggle room, a little bit more play. For us, we bottle at 46% because it's this nice balance between easygoing, approachable, and also giving you more of a distillery influence. It's about that getting that nice sweet spot in there, and without any of that filtration, thinning it out a little bit. It's just about us presenting it in the best possible light. So water, of course, can be added if you find it still a bit hot with the alcohol. And I'd say, yeah, it's just about bringing it down.
Brilliant. And speaking of cask strength and Islay, next month's Scotch single malt that we're sending out is a very nearly cask strength Islay. And it's actually going to be, we've bought 3 casks, blended them together, all the same distillery. So that's a little teaser, which we don't normally do, but since we're on that topic, for those of you like smoky whiskey, there's more coming.
I think every malt has its moment. So every whiskey has its moment. So, and I think Big Peat's an interesting one, especially a little bit later. I appreciate kind of 8:30. Everyone's had their generally eaten already, so your palate's changed. And sometimes when you get to the end of the day, you can have almost like a tired palate. So this big, smoky, real rich influence can become really appealing. Whereas a lot of the time, if you started it early in the day, you find it a bit overwhelming. It's just about choosing the right moment.
It's true. There is, I think, with big smoky whiskies, and as you pointed out once or twice, and I think a few people in the comments have too, this isn't insanely smoky. It's, there's way smokier Islas out there. It's a nice balance, and I think very representative of the island. But nonetheless, it's still quite powerful. I think that whiskies like that can almost sort of take on an experiential thing where it's sort of beyond taste. It's almost like holistic,
Yeah, I think you go on a journey through the glass. You can like through the looking glass, if you like. I think it's really interesting. Lots of people picked up on it in terms of the smell doesn't belie what's in the glass, if that makes sense. So the smell doesn't really prepare you for what follows. And I think a lot of the tasty notes you get with Big Peat are it's so light and fresh in the nose, but then that peat comes through, and it's just never judge a book by its cover. And likewise, you see a bright yellow cartoon man in the front of the bottle, and yet what you have in it is this kind of real excellent quality overriding everything is really what we're after here.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think it's great. Cool. Well, look, Dougal, thanks so much for your time. That was great tasting. I really enjoyed it.
Sorry, I realized we didn't talk too much about the whiskey, but I think it's everything that we're looking for in an Islay dram. Just we like to present it in our way.
Yeah, I think we got it there. And you know what? The things that we didn't say were very much said in the comments. There's reams of it, and it's all very complimentary and quite thorough in describing Big Peat. So it's good. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in as well. And like I say, looking forward to seeing you next